Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll tell you why the president refuses to use his executive orders to force corporations to disclose their campaign contributions. We'll also tell you why Jesus would be appalled by today's Republican Party churches. In countries like India are fighting Big Pharma's price gouging, and we'll explain how the U.S. can do the same thing if we would. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you just now stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
President Obama has the tools at his disposal to pull back the curtain on big money campaign donors. But instead of forcing companies to disclose the candidates they're supporting, Obama's decided to let them continue to operate in the dark. Joining me to talk about this is David Haynes. David, when Mary Jo Wright was put in charge of the SEC, matter of fact, Ring of Fire reported that basically she was a captive to Wall Street. Obama knew that she was a captive to Wall Street. He appointed her anyway because he had gotten so much money from Wall Street. And both the Democrats and Republicans continue to make a ton of money from Wall Street. But here was Mary Jo White, who had been served for years, served the Bank of America as their lawyer, Morgan Stanley as their lawyer, had worked with one of the biggest Wall Street law firms in America, and nevertheless, this president appoints Mary Jo White as if this is a great thing for the country. Now, we see the first thing that's very evident about who she is. Talk about this developing story.
Well, that's right, Papa. Here we had on the SEC agenda a political rulemaking, proposed rule which would have required corporate disclosure through the SEC of political contributions, and now suddenly that has disappeared off the agenda now as a result of Republican pressure and corporate pressure on Mary Jo White and the SEC. So what would have provided a lot of sunlight and transparency on this issue by using an administrative tool through the SEC rather than an act of Congress now has suddenly disappeared.
So this would be the first step that we do to fight back Citizens United, where we have limitless, anonymous money coming from billionaires and multi-billion-dollar corporations, possibly foreign countries. We've even seen situations where it's been coming from illegal activity, coming into the political agenda. And Mary Jo White with the SEC has the right to stop it if she wants, but she chooses to side with Wall Street because Wall Street is the source of so much of the money here. Isn't that kind of the story here?
That definitely is the story. As you said, she has a background as a corporate lawyer right from Wall Street. She tends to favor this corporate culture, believing that disclosure is not appropriate, while meanwhile there is very considerable public support for increased disclosure. Investors want to know, if I own a stock in ABC Corporation, they want to know, who is this corporation contributing to? Where is the money going to these other shadow campaigns and so forth? And as you said, on the heels of Citizens United and McCutcheon and so forth, now it's just becoming a labyrinth of this corporate tangled web. We have no idea where the money is coming from, but we know it is controlling Congress.
Well, we know this, that there are huge political organizations that are shareholder organizations that say, look, we want to put our money into a corporate responsible company. We want to put our money into a corporation that doesn't pollute, doesn't steal from mom and pop pension investors, doesn't do this whole list of awful things whether it comes polluting the water or fracking or drilling offshore. There are a whole bunch of voters who say it matters to me where my money goes. So now these people say, we would like to know if this corporation gave money. It's that simple. And you have this administration, by way of Mary Jo White, saying, no, we're not going to let you know.
Yeah, these are publicly traded corporations. These are not privately held corporations. These companies are being traded on the public stock exchanges, and investors have the right to know where their money is going. This is their money after all. This is not these corporate executives' money. This is the money that belongs to the shareholders, and what decisions are being made, where is the money going, what candidates are they supporting, what shadow campaigns are they putting out there. So this seems entirely reasonable. Well, America is basically isolated from the rest of the world regarding this unlimited disclosure or unlimited giving and no disclosure. And it's not a system which is promoting sunlight and transparency at all in Washington.
Let me ask you this, David. Is there any question in your mind that if this president had the conviction to want to do something about this, he could do it tomorrow simply by firing Mary Jo White? He could fire her tomorrow if he wanted to, couldn't he?
Well, certainly the administration could make this a priority. And it's clear that this is a problem on both sides of the aisle, as you point out. The Republicans are probably the worst offenders and have the most to gain from Wall Street, but there's a lot of money. Democratic candidates are receiving funding as well, and they're being seduced by the almighty dollar. And we know that money corrupts. It's poisoning the well in D.C., all the way from Congress over to the White House. And we just need to clean the whole situation up, and it would be very welcome to see the administration make this a priority.
If this president, rather than, this is his president who, popularity, one of the lowest in history. Now, understand, full disclosure. I put a lot of money into making sure that he got elected. I put a lot of effort into it. You know that I've been a huge Obama supporter, but I've got to call it like it is. And the way that it is the reason his popularity is so bad is because you have progressives like you and a lot of people watching this show who figured him out. And what they figured out is this is a president who has a preference to do things, maybe. He says he wants to do them. On the speech circuit, he says he wants to do it. But what comes right down to it, he won't do it. He could fire Mary Jo White from the SEC tomorrow and put in somebody that would do something about these election laws, couldn't he?
It certainly would be welcome to have somebody heading up the SEC who's not just from a corporate background. I mean, as you said, this really should be an investor-focused, a public-focused institution, and looking out for the investor and not just for the corporation. It does seem time and time again in these spots that we just have the revolving door, and she'll go right back out to the Wall Street world. So it is disappointing that she's not taking a leadership role, that the administration seems to be comfortable with her taking it off the agenda. There were petitions which were circulated, I believe, over 600,000 signatures for there to be disclosure in this area, yet the Obama administration is ignoring it.
Yeah, well, the Obama administration, aren't you tired of hearing those damn Republicans? Well, truthfully, the Republicans have done an awful lot to absolutely obliterate democracy. It's a do-nothing Republican Party, no question about that. I mean, one of the worst we've seen in at least my lifetime. But here you have Obama saying, I can't do anything because of these idiot Republicans. Now, everybody would agree they are idiots. I mean, the leadership up on the Beltway in the Republican Party is dysfunctional. But for this president to say, I can't do anything about this issue because of the Republicans is a total lie, because he could do something about it tomorrow if he wanted. He could get involved tomorrow and make sure that this disclosure of these funds takes place. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is well within the executive's ability to, make reform through this, through the SEC, and there are also other channels as well. They don't have to wait on the act of Congress. Obviously, with a Republican-led House, we're not going to have any reform on this issue anytime soon. And the Democrats have been seduced by the almighty dollar, just like the Republicans have. You would think they would see that it behooves them to increase transparency, because it's probably the Republicans who are getting more funding from corporations on balance, but certainly the Democrats are getting a tremendous amount of funding as well. And this needs to be back on the agenda, needs to be passed.
Yeah, and Hillary Clinton has no interest in doing anything about it because she's going to get a lot of money from Wall Street as well. The truth is, the truth is we have to tell the truth about what's happening. And in this situation, we know something could happen to stop the Citizens United disaster that's plaguing democracy, but we have an administration that won't take the step. Simple step, fire Mary Jo White. Thank you for joining me, David.
Thank you, Pat.
The private mercenary firm Blackwater is finally on trial for committing some of the worst atrocities during the Iraq War. Reports show that the company knowingly killed innocent, unarmed Iraqi civilians, women, and children. And so far, they haven't been held accountable. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for Blackwater's crimes. And I have Abby Martin, the host of RT America's Breaking the Set. She's here to tell us the Blackwater story. Abby, you know, it's a big turnaround when we have private contractors telling our government what they will or won't do after we've given them billion-dollar contracts. This Blackwater story is just really, really an ugly one. Why don't you give us the overview of this?
Yeah, I mean, we just found out through James Risen's excellent reporting that a security contractor, actually the commander of Blackwater in Iraq, weeks before the Nasser tragedy, where Blackwater just indiscriminately fired on a group of people and slaughtered 16 civilians, weeks before that, the commander of Blackwater in Iraq actually told the State Department investigator who was there investigating him that he would kill him if he continued to undermine the company. I mean, we are talking about a security firm that is completely lawless. Not only have they just slaughtered people, they drive around indiscriminately firing on civilians, running them over, firing on animals, smashing cars. Yeah. We have videos of this, Mike. It's unbelievable. And when the investigator came back here, the embassy sided with him. And we renewed their contracts. We've given them $200 million since. I get really upset about it because I just can't believe it.
When you look at the profile of some of these people, you can almost imagine this dull-brained person who grew up as a dull-brained teenager, spent hours and hours, decades playing kill everyone videos, and now they grow in a goatee. They've shaved their head. They have this attitude that they damn sure can do whatever they want to do. And that's what's been going on in Iraq for so long. It's been underreported. The State Department has failed to do virtually anything about it. You have these Bruce Willis wannabes, basically. Bruce Willis wannabes that have more firepower than we have anywhere in the United States, and they are completely unregulated, completely unsupervised at this point. Is that an overstatement at all, Abby?
No. In fact, it's an understatement when you look at how Eric Prince actually has put hits out on people. I mean, we're talking about 2 sworn affidavits from former Blackwater employees who said that Eric Prince, who's also living on a delusional plane of reality that thinks he is ordained by God, Bush style, to akin to the Knights of Templar, to actually carry out a war, a holy war against Muslims. That's another point. But he's actually killed people. I mean, this is under oath that people have said this, and he's threatened the lives of multiple other people too. I mean, this guy needs to be put at the Hague, Mike, and he's just provided safe harbor in Abu Dhabi.
And what appears to be happening when you follow these stories is it's always some conservative operative that comes in to bail Blackwater out. That happened in the story that you're talking about here, where you actually had an investigator that was told, go and investigate how badly this operation is out of control. So he did what he was supposed to do, and he sat in front of this Carroll fella, and as you said, Carroll told him, I will kill you, basically. This is an investigator for the State Department. What did the Obama administration do with that afterwards?
They didn't do much with it. I mean, we just continued to renew the contracts, Mike. I mean, right after the Nasser tragedy, the State Department renewed Blackwater's contracts for another year. And then I found out that the CIA, I mean, they merged with Triple Canopy earlier this month, which is terrifying enough, just to consolidate with another firm that's just as giant. But the CIA just gave them another $100 million contract earlier this year, Mike. So, I mean, he's still raking in the dough. Yeah, there's 3 lowly contractors facing manslaughter charges for the Nasser tragedy. But what about all the other countless dead Iraqis who have died at the hands of Blackwater? What about Eric Prince? What about these lawless gangsters that have done these crimes?
Well, the one thing, if you recall, the issue about Iraq saying, listen, we don't want you here, America. Now, we've seen the result of that, but one reason they were saying we don't want you here is because Obama was saying to them, look, can you give our people immunity? Can you give our Blackwater folks immunity when they kill and pillage your villages? Will you please give us immunity? And of course, the answer was no. I mean, isn't this kind of what's led to where we are in Iraq today?
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up because people actually praise Obama for ending the war in Iraq, and I have to remind them that Bush actually set the timetable and that Obama tried to stay and wanted immunity for war contractors, and they said, no, get the hell out of here. And after this horrible tragedy happened, the prime minister said this is lawless murder. He was like, we need to do something about this. And at the time, Bush finally subject war contractors to criminal courts in the U.S. Why weren't they before? It just shows you, the lawlessness that has led us up to this point, the utter distrust in the U.S. government, the forcing us out of the country. It's a complete disaster, Mike, and it's just unbelievable that we have the same war-hungry neocons who started the Iraq war now calling to bomb it for the third time.
Right. And I guess the reason the Blackwater was so important is they could get away with doing things that armed services could not do. They could murder in ways, in story after story, as you point out, where they did exactly that, and they were held completely unaccountable. The argument always was, gee whiz, we're a contractor. If you want us to do our job, you must give us immunity. And then we found out that what we had was a bunch of freaks over there supposedly doing their job. Stories of them being doped up, drugged up, alcohol parties, prostitution parties, stealing Humvees and crashing them into walls. It was like a frat. It was like a frat party going on. The only difference is you were arming them with AK-47s and worse. And so again, though, the Obama administration sits there, as he always does, as the appeaser, as somebody, well, gee whiz, we just all have to get along. I have to compromise. There has been no compromise here at all. It's been a one-sided effort on the part of not just this particular contractor, but virtually all the contractors we sent to Iraq that have stolen billions of dollars. Hell, we don't know where $12 billion went when we sent it over there wrapped up in foil. We don't even know where that went. But still, this administration, you can't blame all of this on the Bush administration, although they got us into this. They lied their way into it. We still have this president who seems incapable of pushing back. Is that an overstatement of what you've observed?
No, not at all. And in fact, the Republican Party has now forced the Democratic Party into the defense on everything, that if you simply talk about national security whatsoever, scaling it back, then you're weak. I mean, how sad is that? The framing of this debate is just unbelievable, Mike. So Obama's been forced in this position, and I'm not saying that I'm not giving him a pass at all. I think he's been a horrible president, and at the very least, he could charge Eric Prince with something, or all these low-level peoples, and the manager, the top commander in Iraq as well. And I blame the media too, because you have Eric Prince selling a book, going on a media tour, sitting down with Jon Stewart, being allowed to whitewash his criminal history. I mean, this is a problem on so many fronts here.
Well, Abby, let me ask you this. The story has not even been well told about the people who were murdered by Blackwater in the streets. Children, a child, 16-year-old child was murdered there for no good reason. The Blackwater comes out and they say, gee, we were under attack. We had to fire. Okay, now go back and look at the background of these particular soldiers. Go back and take a look at who they are, look at their conduct, and you would say it was inevitable to happen. All you had to do, they were like a bunch of, like I say, Bruce Willis wannabe frat boys, armed to the T, who came out and said, you know what, we had to fire because we were fired upon. The investigation showed absolutely that was not true. Not true, but they weren't under fire. They simply were out there playing with toys is the best way I can describe it. What's your attitude about that particular part of the story?
Well, yeah, no, that's what pisses me off so much, is because they like to rewrite history, and you look at the accounts of what happened. Eric Prince claims that there was this car bomb that went off, and they reacted, and they thought that it was gunfire. Absolutely false on every single front. Not only do they actually have videos out that they proudly filmed of them running over people in the streets and smashing into cars and firing on animals and stuff. And so when this tragedy happened, they literally went out there in a square and just machine gun blasted a group of women and children, Mike, and 16 people tragically lost their lives that day. And it is unbelievable. I mean, think about who joins Blackwater, the people who don't even get in the military, and they're even more psychotic, more war crazy. They joined this guy who actually made it very clear what his motives and agenda were. Lawlessness. They have no constitution, no constitutional allegiance whatsoever. I mean, they're the worst of the worst.
And so they all gather in Blackwater, and we find out that the commander, this Mr. Carroll, the guy in charge, when the investigator from the U.S. State Department came and said, I want to interview you, Mr. Carroll says, listen, buddy, I could kill you and get away with it. And this is the guy working the State Department, and still we hear nothing from this administration. Abby Martin, thank you for joining us. This is an ugly story that really has not gotten any better at all since that massacre that took place in the street has not gotten better at all. I don't anticipate.
Mike, thank you so much for staying on it. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Abby.
Thanks.
Right-wing media outlets like to tell us that Americans are threatened by illegal immigrants and al-Qaeda, but according to research, American citizens are far more likely to be killed by a right-wing extremist right here on our own soil. Joining me now to talk about this is Howard Nations. Howard, you know, it seems like the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and all the national and international police could really help themselves by going ahead and calling a terrorist, when they're a terrorist, go ahead and calling them a terrorist. There's things that attach to being a terrorist. First of all, the agency, the police, the military, they're able to invoke rendition, right, where that person can be grabbed, put away, no lawyer. They can be put into Gitmo, for God's sakes. They're able to say, we're not going to completely follow all the search and seizure laws. So they could use domestic terrorism as a better tool to get some of these right-wing fools, these crazies, off the street. Talk about this story. Why do we call a guy that's got a turban on his head, we call him, he's a terrorist, but a guy out at Bundy Ranch has got a cowboy hat on his head? No, he's just a peaceful activist.
Well, Mike, if you start with the definition of terrorism as violence against innocent citizens that's designed to advance a political cause, then we have two types at least of domestic homegrown terrorists in America. You have the Muslim American terrorists who seek to influence American foreign policy, but then we also have, as you said, the far right-wing American terrorists who are seeking to influence domestic policy and foment change in the ethnic makeup of the country through immigration and defend their perceived racial supremacy. Here's a fact for you, Mike. We are much more likely to be murdered by a far right-wing terrorist than a Muslim American terrorist. But yet the term terrorist applies exclusively by the press and by politicians to the Muslim Americans in the U.S.
I think an analysis that was done by, and I think this is what you're talking from, this article that was done by C.J. Whirlman on Alternet. I interviewed Whirlman a while back, is a brilliant analysis, and that is how we have gotten to the point to where we're afraid to say that some KKK type that has an AK-47 and shoots up a bunch of African Americans or Hispanics because he wants to make a political statement. We are so terrified to go ahead and call them what they are, and that is a domestic terrorist. And the thing is, if we do that, we're able to do a lot more things with that guy. We're able to invoke rendition. We're able to put him in Gitmo. We're able to waterboard him, I suppose. We're able to find out a lot of things if we would just go ahead and have enough courage to say, no, they're no different from an al-Qaeda terrorist. They're killing American citizens, and we ought to be able to do something about that.
Well, far right-wing terrorists in this country in a period of time from 1990 to 2010, there were 145 acts of political violence that resulted in 348 deaths. In the same period of time, American Muslim violence resulted in 20 deaths. The problem is the focus of the government officials and the American media is on the American Muslim violence, and they're virtually ignoring, to our detriment, the far right-wing violence against minorities. And you're absolutely right. They're giving away all the tools of the Patriot Act and all the things that could be done if they would designate the far right-wing terrorists who are doing much more damage to us than the Muslim American terrorists as terrorists.
I mean, it would be great if I'm a police officer And I'm dealing with something that I have the protection of handling this individual as a terrorist. By definition, as I say, there are certain rights that law enforcement has dealing with a terrorist that they don't with a non-terrorist. Something, as I say, like rendition. Something like being able to say, well, you don't have an immediate right to a lawyer. Something where you can say you don't have immediate right to proclaim that search and seizure has been violated. There's all kinds of no speedy trial rule. So if all they have to do is they have to take people like the cat that shot George Tiller, the abortion doctor, or the Tim McVeigh who killed all those people, blew up a federal building. They could have arrested everybody around Tim McVeigh as a terrorist. They could have invoked the same rights that they do at Gitmo and handled them as terrorists, and probably cleaned up an entire cell of domestic terrorists, couldn't they?
Yes, the fellow who shot Dr. Tiller was a member of the sovereign citizens and the neo-Confederates, the people that deny the power of the federal government. And they're so out of control now that they actually did a reenactment of the murder of Tiller on the 5th anniversary of his death. But yet they're just forging right ahead with it. In Kansas City Jewish Center, 3 people were killed, a 14-year-old boy and his grandfather, by Fraser Glenn Cross. He was a founder of the KKK Carolina Knights, the White Patriot Party. Nothing there to look into. He shouted "Heil Hitler" when he was taken into custody. Now the question is, would the coverage on him have been any different by the media if he had yelled "Allah Akbar" instead of "Heil Hitler"?
That's what Whirlman talks about in his article. Yeah. It's just how we characterize it. Whirlman says we're so quick. Like I said, if this fella's got, if he's got head dressing and he has, dark skin, they're going to be handled differently. And all I'm suggesting is, why not use the Patriot Act as a tool right here in the United States? Why is it that we couldn't go on the Bundy Ranch, put them all in a paddy wagon, take them off, rendition, no lawyer, no search and seizure issues, no speedy trial. And if you were able to interrogate every one of those right-wing nuts, you'd have the ability to find out what's going on throughout the country. You wouldn't have another Tim McVeigh bombing. You wouldn't have people trying to, blow up abortion clinics, because we would know all the details about who they are. What is the difference here, and why won't the Justice Department use it the same way that they use it against an Arab terrorist?
Well, because of the right wing. Because what happens, look at Bundy, for example. He was extolled as a hero of the right wing. He was on the talk shows. He was a big hero until he got even too racist, even for the right wing, and they had to drop him all of a sudden. But this is a real problem, Mike. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which is run by a great trial lawyer, our friend Morris Dees, says that there are 939 hate groups in America that are neo-Nazis, Klansmen, white nationalists, neo-Confederates, the skinheads, border vigilantes. But since 2000, hate groups have increased by 56%. They're fueled by anger, they're fueled by the economy because they're in the low income brackets. They're worried about the influx of non-white immigrants, the diminishing white majority. They were fired up considerably by the election of our first African-American president. Patriot groups, and I hate the fact that they've co-opted the word patriot. Patriot groups and armed militia increased from 149 before Obama was president to 1,360 during his first term. They went from 149 to 1,360 during his first term. So, no, there's no racism there.
Howard, these statistics you're using, again, C.J. Whirlman in his article, I know that you read it and I've read it, Homegrown Terrorists, it's all laid out in there. And what you'll conclude when you read that article is the government is losing a very important way to deal with these people, and that's to use the same force and effect of the Patriot Act on them as we do with any other terrorist. These are domestic terrorists. Harry Reid was smart enough to call them that. Unfortunately, most Democrats are so damned afraid of their shadow that they won't repeat it again and again, but it's the truth. Howard Nations, thank you for joining us, okay?
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks.
The Supreme Court's recent Hobby Lobby decision has raised a lot of interesting questions from critics, including what would happen if the owners practiced a religion other than Christianity. Joining me now to talk about that angle is political commentator Chauncey DeVega. You know, Chauncey, you have to, after looking at these recent Supreme Court decisions where they expand the rights of corporations, absolutely, there's no question in their mind that a corporation is no different than you or me or anybody watching. That they think of him as a person. Now, the interesting thing is this is a person that you can't throw in prison. They can be a complete psychopath, and you can't throw the corporation in prison. As you know, what I do for a living is I sue these corporations for the most horrendous activity, whether it's BP destroying an entire ecosystem or whether it's a pharmaceutical company creating a pill that they know are going to kill children, for example. You still can't throw them in prison. So this Supreme Court has really stepped in at this time, haven't they?
They have opened up Pandora's box where the outcomes are wholly predictable. I never would have imagined that we would be sitting here having a conversation about a court that is really pushing the country towards an American theocracy, where they have decided that the Supreme Court quite literally will play referee and judge and decide what religions, quote unquote, count and what religions do not count. There's something else to think about here too, and that's I like to call it a legion of doom, trying to figure out who are the various players who advocated for this Hobby Lobby decision. So on one hand, you have the corporatists that, as you know, simply care about money. They're the 1%, and anything they can do to expand corporate power to make money they're in favor of.
And so they were in charge. In other words, their argument was we're a person. In other words, they didn't really care about the religion aspect. They just wanted to say, if you say to us as a corporation, you now have the right to test constitutional religious issues, then that makes us more of a person. So that's what Wall Street was interested in. Now go to the other fanatical side, the religious fanatics, the jihadists, the Christian jihadists. Talk about that a little bit.
We like to call them the American Taliban that you did a great job of exposing in Jesus Camp. They're the believers. They actually think that this country should be a theocracy. And there's an old, ugly history that a lot of folks are not familiar with in this country, where the language of religious freedom and freedom of speech has actually been used to support oppression, racism, and Jim and Jane Crow. The third element we have to pay attention to are the libertarians. They hate government, and they're happy and they're smiling at the Hobby Lobby decision because this is one more nail in a we the people democracy. Anything that makes the government and our we the people democracy weak enough to drown like a baby in a bathtub, they're smiling for. So you have this legion of doom / murderers row that's come together in favor of this horrible Hobby Lobby decision.
Well, one thing was clear. The law was just, it was just abundantly clear. This U.S. Supreme Court had made a decision that was, it wasn't even a questionable at all. It was a Supreme Court decision that said, back in the 60s, that a corporation, which in this situation was a barbecue business, they sold barbecue, and they said that corporation doesn't have the right to extract a First Amendment argument where it comes to discrimination. All right? There was no question. It's very clear. It was the law of the land up until this idiot court majority that we have right now said that they completely ignored that. But they also, by implication, said there are no constitutional rights that flow to a for-profit corporation. They are not a person. So what if, Chauncey, that we have an influx of Islam in this country? They come in, they migrate to this country, they immigrate to this country, and all of a sudden we have sects of immigrants that are Islamic immigrants who say, gee whiz, we own a corporation and we think all of our employees should have the right to, we should be able to demand that our employees follow Sharia law. Isn't that where this goes? Why is it that it's so obvious to everybody that's analyzed this except the Supreme Court majority that wrote the opinion?
I mean, as we talked about this before, as I said, I have a great piece that's on my own site, chaunceyDeVega.com, via the Daily Cost. I got about 70,000 Facebook shares where I asked the very same question. How would white Christians respond if a Muslim-owned company decided to impose its religious values on its employees? We know right now on Fox News they're caught up in Sharia hysteria over nothing. But if that actually happened, and I'm not saying this with hyperbole or exaggeration, we know there would be madness in the streets, and the Fox News hate talkers will be talking about getting the gasoline and the pitchfork to go attack mosques. Here's another thing we really have to think about, and I'm sure you have meditated on this too. A corporation is simply a legal entity. It does not have to be owned by Americans. So what would happen, as you pointed out, if a group of Saudi Arabians decided to use their money to open a corporation in this country and enforce Sharia law on their employees? And that is an outcome that we have to consider. The other thing we have to really ask ourselves—
And by the way, Chauncey, that's not a remote outcome. You understand that what we have happening in this country now is you have multinational conglomerates that are simply coming here to the United States and colonizing. I mean, extracting everything they can, taking our cheap labor, taking, if they want to frack, they frack. If they want to pollute our water, they do that. They're multi-conglomerate corporations coming here. Now, as you point out, what happens when they come from Dubai and they end up in Alabama and they say, gee whiz, we're a very religious corporation and we just cannot abide by anything except Sharia law? I mean, this is not rocket science. Unfortunately, Alito, the person who wrote this, is far from a rocket scientist. I mean, he never should be on this court to begin with. Never should have made the appellate court to begin with. He's simply a tool of the conservative right. So he writes a bad opinion, and now we have to live with it.
The other thing we have to think about, too, the American Bar Association had a great friend of the court brief. You probably read it. And they're hardly a liberal or radical organization. And they said that this decision will create chaos because it's going to force corporations, in order to serve their shareholders, quite literally, to adopt religious beliefs in order to get a competitive advantage. So let's say I have a corporation and I say, you know what? I want to save money by not enforcing anti-discrimination laws. Or I don't want to follow environmental laws because my God tells me that I can destroy and pollute the environment because the land was given to me in perpetuity. Well, if one corporation does that, another corporation is going to have to do it. And the ABA and their friend of court brief said that this Hobby Lobby decision, if decided in favor of them, would create chaos and would be one of the worst decisions in recent American legal history, and it will destroy many of the standing principles underlying corporate law.
And let me point out, this American Bar Association that you're talking about is wholly owned and operated by corporate lawyers. They're not consumer lawyers. They're lawyers that represent big corporations. They're silk stocking kind of lawyers that just represent corporations. They even said what a disaster this is. And so I think when you consider that they actually represent corporations, they understand what's getting ready to happen. The floodgates are going to open, and what are we going to see here?
We're going to see mass mayhem, and we're already seeing different institutions basically saying we don't have to obey certain parts of United States law because they're against our quote-unquote religious beliefs. And I'll push it a little farther. We went to the example of what would happen if radical political Islamists opened a business here and tried to enforce their beliefs on their employees. What if white supremacists, using this law, said, you know what? My God tells me I don't believe that the races should be mixed. Now, in the 1960s, that court said, heck no. But the court we have today may very well agree and say, you know what? Maybe it is that religious beliefs trump civil rights law. And again, there's an ugly history here. Remember Bob Jones University. Back in the 60s with these right-wing culture warriors, they had segregated schools. When the courts did the right thing and said, no, that's a violation of the personhood and civil rights of African Americans, these white Jim and Jane Crow types, they went and established their own schools called Christian academies or freedom schools. And the way they got away with it was by saying it's not about race, it's about religion.
Right.
And the Supreme Court is opening up that floodgate again.
Right, and the case that you're talking about, the Newman versus Piggy Park Enterprises, that was actually part of the argument there, is they said that they were against race because they were afraid of interracial marriage, and that was against their religious leanings. And that Supreme Court said, to hell with you. That's a ridiculous argument. They threw it out. As a matter of fact, they made that individual pay for all the court costs, which were in the tens of thousands. That's what we ought to be seeing instead of this radical, conservative, knee-jerk bunch of politicians, Republican politicians, in robes that make up the Supreme Court majority. They're not judges. They're politicians in robes. Thank you for joining me, Chauncey. I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
The Republican Party likes to hide behind the Bible when they oppress portions of the American population, but the truth is that Jesus Christ has absolutely nothing in common with today's Republican Party church. Joining me now to tell us why Jesus would certainly not be a Republican is Frank Schaeffer, author of the new book, Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. Frank, there's something that the organized church ought to be terrified about right now, and it seems that you have older members are dying off and the youth simply is not recycling through. And when they try to understand what that's about, the reason that churches are having such trouble attracting youth is because of what they're trying to sell. And the thing that they seem to be trying to sell is it's taking further and further away from the teachings of Jesus and more towards the corporate church, if you've ever walked through the Sistine Chapel, which I'm sure you have, you look around there and you say, what in the world is this about? Is this what Jesus wanted? Gold everywhere, the artwork, millions and millions of dollars worth of artwork, just the upkeep is millions every month. Is this what Jesus wanted? And when you talk to youth who aren't going into the church, they're saying, this bothers me. What's your take on it?
Well, my take is exactly that, and that is the evangelical establishment that I came out of, I left it, having been one of the instigators of the religious right along with my dad back in the 70s and 80s. What's happening now is really odd. When we were in it, it was all about being anti-abortion and anti-feminist, and that was bad enough. And that's what I left. Now, 30 years later, what's happening is that corporate America, people like the Koch brothers with their unlimited ability to give hundreds of millions of dollars into the Republican coffers of secret money because of the Supreme Court, have basically bought and paid for the votes of the white evangelical aging middle class by ticking these litmus test boxes of being anti-gay, anti-woman, limit access to contraceptives as they've just done through Wheaton College, and this ruling on the Supreme Court with Hobby Lobby and the Wheaton College thing. When young people look at this, most of whom are not homophobic and anti-gay, most of whom have been grown up in a world in which the women around them are looked at as equal partners for work and for life, they're just not going along with this program anymore. And so this kind of hard right litmus test approach to politics is alienating a lot of people. And of course, the Republicans are caught in a loop, because they have to keep becoming more extreme in order to keep what I'll call the Fox News viewer in line, this aging white Republican. But the price is they're losing the imagination of the next generation by selling out to what are really just corporate interests. People like the Koch brothers who are into getting regulations on the environment taken away, taxes taken away, drilling for oil, the coal business, all the rest of it. This was never the agenda of even the evangelical movement. So, you look over the years and it's moved from being a series of moral litmus tests that are still used to raise money and get votes. But the real agenda now is the Koch brothers and the big corporate American machine.
Here's what I think people who followed your career understand that you've written just great books about this area. Your father probably was, you and your father were two of the very best known evangelical preachers maybe in the world at one point. Now, you abandoned all that. You said that you saw something that bothered you as kind of, I don't know what age you were, but you saw through all of this evangelical fanaticism. Now, what did you? You wrote a great new book, and in this great book, you've contrasted the life that Jesus lived. How Jesus abandoned all of these things were being handed to him by an organized church. Talk about that just a little bit. Put it in perspective to help us understand why it is that the youth in this country right now are saying, we don't want any more of this formalized, high-structured church. We don't want that anymore. Give us the differences between what Jesus did and what we're seeing now in America. Well, all over the world, frankly.
Well, what's ironic here in religion in America is this, and that is evangelicals claim to be following Jesus, but actually the giveaway is they call themselves people of the book, and really it's an idolatry of the Bible. Now, the curious thing when you look at Jesus as the lens through which to see the Bible is Jesus comes to passages where people are being judged, such as the woman taken in adultery or the Samaritans that were supposed to be this other tribe they had nothing to do with. And every time he looks at the Torah, which was the Old Testament in those days, the Bible the Jews have, he says, look, the Torah says this, let's stone people to death who are taken in adultery. But here's what I say. We have a new way to approach this, and it's to accept and love, and don't throw a stone unless you're innocent. Here's a Torah passage that says, don't touch a leper. He says, no, but what I'm going to do is reach out and touch the leper. I don't care what it says. Here's a passage that says, women who bleed are dirty, and now you're defiled if a menstruating woman touches you. He's saying, go ahead. It's good you touch me. Your faith makes you whole. Everywhere you look at Jesus' teaching, he's going past the organized religion. He's going past what would have amounted to be the church authorities of his day. And he's saying, look, truth and spirit is what matters, not geography, not tribe, not who got the Holy Land, not who are the Jews, not who are the Gentiles. It's a completely different paradigm. And I think a lot of young evangelicals see that. So in my book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, one of the things I argue toward the end of the book is that rather than following Jesus, even though you hear it all the time, you know, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I was driving down in North Carolina a while back going to something called the Wild Goose Festival of young former evangelicals who have just burned out on this stuff. And ironically, when I was pulling into the valley where this festival is held, there was a big gun store, and it said guns and ammo, and then a huge red poster over it, Jesus is Lord. Well, most young evangelicals are not, you know, out there slathering to carry guns in public and open carry. They're not NRA members. They are not joining their big local super church. They are trying to find out that if they're followers of Jesus Christ, who was this person? So the actual Jesus we read about in the New Testament is reaching out and touching the untouchables. He's not excluding gay people. Whereas the evangelical megachurch, Wheaton College, these other places today using the Supreme Court Hobby Lobby ruling are looking for exemptions from having to even give civil rights to gay people, or exemptions for having to provide contraceptives to women. So we really got two things going on. We have the big evangelical establishment that in the Old Testament and the New Testament would be the Pharisees. We have young evangelicals trying to follow Jesus that I talk about in my book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And in that book, I think I make a very clear argument for the fact that people who call themselves Christians of any kind have a choice, and that is they can either try to follow the example and the actual teaching of Jesus, or they can follow the American evangelical politicized far-right corporate establishment.
Yeah, and that's the important thing. I mean, what's happened is if you read, I know you've read the Gospel of Thomas. Well, the Gospel of Thomas is not even in the Bible, because Constantine and his crew said, well, we don't want to put this in the Bible because Thomas suggests there should not even be a structure. Thomas suggested a church is not brick and mortar. A church is not made up of brick and mortar. The church is, do you believe? You know, do you believe? And how do you live your life as you believe? Because it does defeat it defeats the build out of the corporate church structure, and that's what's scaring the hell out of young people who unfortunately are being driven away from their faith.
Now, there's a lot of young people coming out of evangelical backgrounds who look at their own groups and say, we're going to exclude gay people, we're going to exclude women from the pulpit, we want everything that corporate America has, we're materialistic, we're looking to God to basically make us rich, whatever the spin is, and they're rejecting it. So I think that actually there's a very hopeful thing going on right now in certain religious circles on a very big scale. And that is that, yes, the people making the news are the people going to the Supreme Court asking for exemptions on providing contraceptives. They're the Koch brothers getting the Supreme Court to allow them to give unlimited dark money to the Republicans and cashing in on these moralistic litmus tests that the religious right are running. But there's a whole other current underneath that I've tapped into when I go speak. And I meet a lot of young people who, by the way, are emailing me, and I'm not exaggerating you, in droves off this new book of mine, saying, thank you for telling our story. Thank you for standing up and saying there's a whole other way to look at religion.
Yeah,
and
Frank,
embrace doubt, and not only that, but try to embrace the spirit of what Jesus was actually saying. So,
Frank, they're really just tired of being mindless soldiers for the right, and I think that's what's happening. Frank Schaeffer, thank you for joining us, okay? Great information. Great book, by the way. Everybody to read it if you want to understand what's happening out there in the world of religion. The world of religion needs to work to save itself, so young people are now attracted to it rather than being driven away. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The drug industry is one of the worst when it comes to marking up their products, and they're able to get away with this because of a special deal they've worked out with our government. But other countries are fighting back against big drug price gouging, and I have Seth Katz here to explain how they're doing that. Seth, Big Pharma has been on the march all over the United States, basically trampling consumers, trampling the FDA, trampling anybody who is a critic of theirs at all. What's happening throughout the world? Are they getting away with those same things throughout the world?
You know, Pat, they're really not. In some countries, the regulatory agencies stand up to them much more than the FDA does. The governmental agencies are standing up to them much more on multiple fronts, whether it's their patent protection or whether it's their marketing or whether it's just the approval process. But it seems for some reason here in the U.S., the most developed nation in the world, we lag behind on many of those basic issues.
We used to see these corporations going in third world countries, whether it's India, whether it's South America, South Africa, and they would go in and they would do experiments by the thousands. They would absolutely leave people lame and crippled and dead sometimes with their experiments. And the way they did that was they would spread around graft money through the leadership in a place like India. Has that changed, or what's going on in India with pharma right now?
You know, in India, the way that they're taking on Big Pharma is by challenging their ability to get patent exclusivity. Recently, with regard to Gleevec, which is a drug that costs about $80,000 a year here for a patient to use it, the Indian government denied Novartis's patent protection so that they have the exclusive right to sell it. And it was based on a decision that it really all Gleevec is the combination of two other pre-existing drugs. And what's happened there is it's opened the competition up, and now patients there can get what costs $80,000 a year here for an entire year of use of the drug for about $1,000 for, in essence, what they're calling a high-quality generic version of the same product. So they're really taking on the pharma's ability to get their patent exclusivity and the ability to charge the high prices that we all know get charged. And we all know that the companies will charge what the market can bear. And as you and I know from experience in many, many cases, the pharma companies charge more in the U.S. than in any other company in the world. Why? Because they can.
Okay, so in the United States, we would love to say, okay, well, that person that's paying $80,000 a year ought to be able to get, I mean, today with internet, you ought to be able to order the stuff from anywhere in the world, places like India. If you could get it, rather than paying $80,000, you ought to be able to pay $1,000. But the pharmaceutical companies even interfered with that, and this administration and every administration basically has gone along with them on that. They've said, no, you can't order overseas. I mean, talk about that a little bit.
That's true, Mike, but the one thing that has to come to a head is if the drugs that the pharmaceutical products can't come here from overseas, at what point does it make it economically feasible to go there and get them and then bring back your own self-use? Certainly if you're talking about a difference of $79,000, you can buy a lot of round-trip airfare to go save that kind of money.
Well, aren't they trying to close the loophole on that? In other words, used to be you could go to Canada, you could buy the drugs in Canada, you go to Mexico, and then the pharmaceutical companies came up first of all with this PR scam where they said, gee whiz, you shouldn't buy the drugs in Canada because they're not as good. Truthfully, they were exactly the same thing. But in Canada, a drug that maybe cost 10 cents to manufacture, they only sold for $2. But that same drug that only cost 10 cents to manufacture here, they sold for $60. So, right. I mean, those numbers are pretty exact, too, the markups that they have in the United States. Do you remember the deposition, Seth, that we took on a case, and we asked in that case, why is it that you're charging more? I think it was 6 times the amount that they were charging in places like Germany and Asia. why are you charging more in the United States? And their answer was, because we can. Do you remember that?
You know, it's a common refrain in many of the depositions you and I have worked on together, Mike, is that they'll charge what the market can bear. I mean, if you did some research in getting ready for today, the cost of Celebrex for 100 tablets cost Pfizer 60 cents to make 100 tablets. And what's the consumer price? A little over $130. Claritin, again, 100 tablets. Cost of all those active ingredients, 71 cents. Cost to the consumer, $215. Lipitor, 100 tablets. Cost to make it, $5.80. Consumer price, $272. That's a 4,696%
Seth, let me ask
markup.
You, has the industry been reined in at all under this administration? Has the pharmaceutical drug industry been reined in at all?
It doesn't appear that they've been reined in at any level under this administration, whether it's off-label promotion prosecutions, and they've happened, and they've had large settlements, but it hasn't stopped the industry. Why? Because at these markups of 4,700%, there's a lot more money to be made by selling the product than by paying fines.
Yeah, so in other words, they can pay a $450 million fine and still make a lot of profit. Well, Seth, thank you for joining me. This story just continues to get crazier and crazier. The longer the pharmaceutical companies, the longer they spread around money, the tougher it is for the consumers. Thanks for joining me.
As always, a good time seeing you, Mike.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.